In this video, we're going to cover local development. To do that, I'm going to begin by introducing the context and the different eras of the way that economists have studied the impact of sports teams, stadiums, and events on their local economies. Then I'm going to introduce the concept of public costs, how that's evolved over time. I'll then introduce the idea of metropolitan area data, and then we'll look at the different ways that economists have studied the impact of sports teams, stadiums, and events on their local economy in the way that they impact local income level, local employment, and then how economists have addressed the idea of endogeneity, and then we'll look at sort of the special case of the application of that to minor league baseball. This is taken from a paper by J.C. Bradbury, Dennis Coates, and Brad Humphreys, published in the Journal of Economic Surveys in 2022, titled The Impact of Professional Sports Franchises and Venues on Local Economies. Okay, so between 1970 and 2020, there were $33 billion in public funds used to construct major league sport venues. And the public paid for 73% of this construction cost of these different venues. Economists have extensively studied the impact of sports teams, events, and venues on their local economies, right? And the early literature demonstrated a very notable lack of tangible benefits to local economies. And then later on, work focused on localized cost and benefits, which we're going to save for another lecture, and we'll have a whole series of these eventually. The other thing that we want to think about eventually down the road, and we'll talk a little bit about in this lecture, are the intangible benefits that might come from hosting them. So in this lecture, we're really going to be focused on the measurement of tangible benefits. Okay, so the upshot of the local development story is that sports do not cause growth in their economies because related activity is a transfer rather than net new spending. And this is an important idea, this what we call additional spending or net new spending, right? So sports, teams, events, stadiums, all these things definitely attract non-locals, right? Like we see people come in from out of town and do business in a city they wouldn't otherwise do, which is why proponents of building stadiums, attracting teams, or hosting big events often point to the potential benefits that sports could have to their local economy. The problem, though, is that this comes with what economists call crowdout. And so this comes in two very important ways. The obvious one would be other tourist attractions that already existed in the city. They're also going to be competing for these non-locals or just other, right? It could be literally the same people or just other non-locals that would have otherwise traveled to the city that are then going to see worse hotel rates, busier cities, and just other events that they might not want to be in conflict with, and therefore the sports, yes, will attract some non-locals, but also push some non-locals away. It's important, though, to remember most spending in a city is going to still come from locals. It's just not going to come from people outside of the city. And there's this broader economy going on, and sports-related spending is just going to be a very small part of the total economy. So the problem then is your local businesses, your local firms and competitors are going to be the ones that end up bearing the cost of a sports team, stadium, event coming to their town by losing customers or having to contend with higher prices, etc. So let's lay down some context. In the 1970s and forward, there have been 80 stadiums built, right? Sort of that early area in the 1970s. There are 130, let me be very clear. Before 1970, there were 80 stadiums built. Between 1970 and 2020, there were 135 stadiums built for pro sports. That's about 2.5 a year. So to me, that seems like quite a high rate, right? So the average stadium, when it was replaced, was 27 years old. So we have 2.5 stadiums built per year. and we have the stadium being 27 years old when it's phased out. So here's a graph showing us the major league sports venues opened in the United States and Canada between 1970 and 2020. So we can kind of see these eras of stadium construction kind of being bunched together, and you see this really active era there in the 90s into the early 2000s. So from 1960 to 1980, the MLB typically shared multi-purpose stadiums, right? And so we had stadiums like the classic Astrodome built in this giant circle. They're called cookie cutter stadiums, and the seating is laid out, and then there's this little playing surface there, and then for football, the stadiums would have been the seating would have been arranged differently within the stadium, but all this circular area out on the outside would stay the same. So as both the MLB and NFL grew, and the NFL really in particular because it began to grow faster, we began to see new stadiums pop up, and that's what really caused this growth starting in 1970 and going forward. And this happened for two big reasons. One is there's a different playing surface, and so the stadium shape needed to be different for NFL teams versus MLB teams. If we look now, MLB stadiums are shaped sort of in a pizza slice or a pie shape where we've got more seats behind home plate and fewer out on the outside of the outfield, whereas NFL stadiums, the best seats are, of course, along the side of the field on either side. Additionally, premium seating became very important for the NFL because of revenue sharing. So NFL teams wanted to make as much revenue as they could and then keep as much revenue as they could, and they would do that by building stadiums with more and more premium seating that was then exempt from the revenue sharing. So teams that get a new stadium outpace the teams that don't have new stadiums by enormous numbers. This can be by a factor of 20 for MLB and NBA teams and a factor of almost 40 for NFL teams. Now, in the 2010s, we saw the rate of new construction end up falling, and the median public share of that total cost was about 73%. This, of course, is just a certain subset of what it is that was included in the stadium cost, and this often omitted some very large and important costs that aren't directly poured into concrete in building the stadium. And that would be the cost of the land, the infrastructure around the stadium, roads and different things like that, the operations, right? So not just the construction and the labor there, but the operation of the whole project, capital improvements, municipal services, and then a big one is foregone property taxes. So often teams attract or agree to build a new stadium, and part of the deal is to freeze the property value that the stadium is going to be built on, because of course if you have a piece of land that's sitting empty, the value of it is very low compared to $1 billion stadium, and the property taxes on that improvement would be very high. And in order to retain their team or to attract a team, city will often agree to forego those property taxes in order to attract that. So including these omitted costs might raise that public cost by 25 to 40%. So the 73% number might even be low. So let's take a look at some of what the trend is. So in the 1970s, the share of the public's cost of stadiums was pretty much 100%. And so you kind of quickly, what we're looking at here with the graph is triangles are arenas, circles are stadiums, and these kind of lines represent the average over a decade. So the dark dash line are the median, and the small lines there are the mean. And you can see the share of public cost was very high, and then over time it sort of falls down here around 50%, right? So the share of what the public was paying for these stadiums ends up going down over time. At the same time, okay, so what's happening here in this graph? The public cost is the shaded in, and the private cost is the not shaded in area. So we see a trend of a real quick growth in recent years of the total cost of the stadium, but we see that the amount that the public is spending sort of going up slowly in the amount that the private part of that spending going up very quickly, leading to a very rapid rise in total cost. So Quirk and Fort, 1997, of course, this paper would look even better if it had been done more recently, came with an idea called gold plating. And that's the idea that stadium opulence is positively correlated with public subsidies. And that is 20 to 50% of each additional $1 million in subsidy goes to stadium opulence. So, not that the stadium needs these particular things, but it gets fancier and nicer. So the money has to go somewhere. It gets directed into the opulence of the stadium rather than any other type of feature. Good example, this is the year 2020, where two stadiums with greater than $1 billion in cost were built. One was SoFi in Los Angeles, which was a $4 billion project. The other was Allegiant in Las Vegas, both of which are known to be quite fancy stadiums. This, of course, is also factored in that it's often local governments doing this subsidy. And what they'll do is they then qualify for a federal tax exemption. So there's a bond interest exemption, which then lowers that cost of this private building to those team owners and encourages this gold plating process. Let's turn now to metropolitan area data. And so we've kind of set the table for the scope and the size, and the public share of the cost, etc. And we want to turn to how economists have studied this. So economic studies on sports stadiums began really following that construction boom, and we see lots of studies starting in the 1990s. And the reason for this is that new stadiums really raised concern over public funding. So there was this outcry where people were asking, are these stadiums really doing anything for the economy? Are we suspending these large amounts? Remember, the public share at this time is close to 100%. Are we really getting anything in our economy in exchange for this? The problem was that prior research was done by consulting firms, not academics, and these consulting firms being paid by the cities, and the cities wanted to attract the team and build the stadium, they have a vested interest in finding positive effects. Okay, it's really important that along this time we see greater and greater improved data availability. So early on, what studies do is they run relatively simple multiple regression. They study teams and stadiums and their effect on metropolitan statistical areas. So they're looking at fairly large geographic areas, and they're looking at data that's capturing all of the economic activity in a very large area into a handful of statistics measured at usually a year rather than months or quarters. Okay, so the one of the most seminal papers that summarizes sort of early branch of the literature is by Knoll and Zimbalist in 1997, which it labeled the unattractive economics of stadiums. Quote, in every case, authors find that the local economic impact of sports teams and facilities is far smaller than proponents allege. In some cases, it's even negative. These findings are valid regardless of whether the benefits are measured for the local neighborhood, the city, or the MSA in which the facility is located. So, the first paper, really the first two papers, are both by Bade and Dye, and these study the 1960s to the 1980s, and they look at MSA impacts, and they study stadiums' impact on income per capita and the share of state employment. And they find no positives and some negatives. So it's sort of the first paper that looks at this kind of big areas and the way that these stadiums are impacting it. Okay, other early work, like Rosentraub, 94, they study Indianapolis, and Indianapolis's aggressive redevelopment project that was heavily focused on a sport-centric way of doing that, and they looking that compare them to other similar Midwest cities that didn't engage in the same, right? So we can see there's a similar city that didn't have a sports-based redevelopment project. How did their gains look? And Rosentraub finds that maybe there are some small gains there. The upshot, though, is that we got to remember that sports are a tiny part of any economy, and so studying them the way these first papers did sort of have limited application. But over time, we began to see kind of studies focusing on more specific things and doing more sophisticated economics. What I want to focus on now is studies that look at what happened to income when a team is attracted to a city or a stadium is built. So Coates and Humphreys, 1999, look at per capita income level for MSAs that host sports teams, and they study different types of what they call sport environmental variables, which is the presence of a team or teams, the building of a new stadium, and then the entry of a new team into a market or the exit of a team into a market. They find a negative correlation with income level and a team, but they find no correlation at all with income growth, which is to say, MSAs that have these teams, or they build a stadium, or they have a team enter the market, actually show that their level of income is lower, but it doesn't correlate with whether that income level is going up or going down. Okay, so one explanation for this would be perhaps residents accept lower income for those intangible, non-pecuniary, that's non-money, benefits that come with a team. You might just want to live in a city with a team, and you'll accept there being lower income level there than you would in a equal, the same city that doesn't have a team. Coates 2015 follows up on this, sort of revisits that 1999 paper. They add NHL and MLS to that data set that was looking at MLB and NFL, and I think NBA as well, and they largely confirm the 1999 study. Another important paper is Liturgiwaka and Cochrane in 2007, and they do what's called a financial event study. So an event study is when you look at a particular point in time that something happens, and then you see what the effects are over the course of time, where you can sort of relate that to the particular event. And they look at expansions and relocations of teams. They also find a negative association with income per capita, both in the short run and long run. So we see this consistent trend in the studies that look at income and say, when we look at the level of income, it is poorer cities that have sports teams and stadiums being built. Okay, there's a couple newer papers then that also study this. Remember that we're sort of looking at the early period here. Profiter 2012 studies basketball arenas, studies arenas because they're typically cheaper, they're more multi-purpose, they can host NHL and NBA concerts, etc. And so they look at the relationship between the MSA and the NBA, and they find mixed effects. What they show is early on, in early eras, there's a positive effect when those arenas are located in the central business district. So when you've got in sort of a downtown, a very high economic activity, a multi-purpose arena, there's the small positive effect. But then eventually, in the modern era, we get basketball-only stadiums. That effect actually flips, and after 2000, we actually see a negative effect consistent with the previous literature. And then Jacina, and Rothoff, 2008, they sort of take on this idea that maybe it's not the specific growth outcome, but what we call positive spillovers. So we've met the multiplier effect before in this class, and what this study finds is that it can't be more than one, that one-to-one multiplier that we talked about before, and that worker wages and host MSAs actually take a hit from hosting a sports team. Now that we've talked about income, let's turn our attention to employment. Let's look at Hudson 1999, one of the first papers that sort of said, we've looked at some income, let's look at some employment figures now. And what they do is they look at MSAs that either gained or lost teams, and they find no positive effect. Quote, available evidence cast doubt on the ability of a professional sports team to act as an economic engine. Coates and Humphreys in 2003 also studied this, and what they say is, well, maybe we need to look at the industries whose employment would be related to this. So they look at amusement and recreation. So they're going to be affected by the presence of a sports team. And what they find is this is a small positive for a sports team to be in that MSA. The problem, however, is while employment goes up, we actually see a decrease in earnings and then a decrease in employment in other sectors. And this explains why commercial sports activity can really seem like it's going to be a positive benefit for a local economy, but when you actually look at the economic activity, you don't see this presence of the team actually translate into increased economic activity, because perhaps you can have employment in amusement and recreation, but it's going to have a decreased employment in other sectors. Perhaps you can have benefit of new job creation in one particular industry, but earnings overall will actually fall. So Miller 2002 looks at a specific case study of two large stadium projects in St. Louis and find if you look at construction in particular, you see that there's no impact on either jobs or wages. So we see kind of a bleak picture in terms of employment as well. So one of the things that could explain this is what we call endogeneity, and in this case specifically reverse causation, which is the idea that perhaps we're looking at a particular relationship and then we are thinking A is causing B, but perhaps B is actually causing A. So perhaps it's the case that poor economic conditions attract sports rather than sports causing the poor economic conditions, right? So rather than a cause, maybe the sports are a symptom of the problem. So we've got a couple studies that look at that. Coates and Humphreys 2001 and 2002 take a very important approach, and they look at these exogenous shocks, right? So we can't tell when a team moves to a city whether we've got reverse causation or whether we've got causation right. But if something else is happening, like labor shocks, lockouts, or making the playoffs, then that is not going to be related to the decisions that were made to move a team or not. And so we can look at the potential benefits or costs. So in the case of labor shocks or lockouts, you could see negatives happen to the economy that then wouldn't be endogenous to that relationship. Unfortunately, what Coates and Humphreys find is there's no income on per capita income from these negative shocks, and the positive shock of making the playoffs also shows no impact on per capita income. So what they say is, look, it might be the case that a team was attracted or not attracted to an area based on the economic conditions, and so we wouldn't be able to tell which caused which. But if these exogenous things happen, then we could say this wasn't caused by that decision. It happened from outside of this particular decision, and that can tell us something about whether sports teams actually cause growth or don't. Okay, another way to go about it is what we call synthetic control. Synthetic control is a very sophisticated technique where you can take the treated group, and then using the non-treated group, you can construct a comparison point. Okay, so that's hard to think about, so let's talk about it. Well, synthetic control popped up actually in the economic development literature first, and so what happened is you might have a policy be applied in a particular country, and that country has lots of different factors and different things that we can measure that make it up, but those will be unique to that country, right? So we might have employment, inflation, different exchange rates, all different kind of variables we could put together. And no one country, when we look at it, is going to be a good comparison point, right? We could compare to other similar countries, or we could take all the other countries that didn't adopt this kind of policy, and then we can take the features from those countries, and then we can sort of use that to construct a comparison point. So it'd be like saying, the United States, and we want to compare that, and so or look at 50% Canada and 50% Britain or something, and that might give us a better control than just comparing the US to Canada or the US to Britain. A crude example, but I think you get the idea. Here, what happens is Islam takes 3 NFL cities, compares them to other cities, none of which are exactly similar, but can kind of create comparison points based on different variables, employment, income, and things like this that give us a measure of what that city is like and kind of create a different weighting of these different characteristics to create what we call a synthetic control. And what Islam finds is there's no evidence of improved income or employment. So we've actually got at the reverse causation idea pretty directly with these studies. Now, one other neat thing to mention is the study of minor league baseball. And this is important because minor league baseball is much more dispersed around different types of cities than major sports. If you think about major sports, you're going to have bigger, more populous cities. And if you think about minor league baseball, you have many more sort of, still larger cities, but not these giant metropolises that are hosting major scale professional sports. Okay, so we have 2 important papers on that. And one of them studies the positive correlation between minor league teams and stadiums and per capita income, and they don't have that negative association with income that major sports do. That is, there's probably less displacement in a city like Amarillo that has a minor league team than perhaps a city like Oklahoma City that has a major professional basketball team. Okay, the follow-up paper in 2021 looked at Major League Baseball and minor league baseball using a very sophisticated statistical technique called difference in difference, where you take and compare 2 groups that didn't have something before, and then you compare them after, when one of them, in this case, got a minor league team and one of them didn't get a minor league team. And they're able to, using both major league and minor league, look at 900 MSAs, which is a much bigger data set than what we're seeing before, and they end up finding no impact on income and employment. So what's the upshot of this, right? Well, in general, studies on MSA show little evidence of strong or positive economic impacts on urban areas from major sports teams or stadiums. And the reason for this is that we see a large displacement effect, which disproves the common consulting claim of large positive impacts on their local economies. The upshot then is that there's probably no effect on employment, and we might even see a negative impact on income from a major sports team, stadium,